Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining me today. This is our first research seminars at the School of Information and Communication Studies in 2026, and I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country. As a member of Charles Sturt University community, we acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra, and Birapai peoples of Australia, whose land our university was founded on, and we share their aspiration of Yindimara Vunanana, as they invite us to all learn the wisdom of respectfully living well in the land worth living in. And I pay my respect to any First Nation peoples present here today. I am Nilüfer Solcu, a lecturer in the School of Information and Communication Studies, and I am co-organizing the SICS seminar series with my colleague, Victoria Erskine. I encourage you to introduce yourself as well in the chat box, as also your country or location. So today we are hearing from Anita. Dr. Anita Dewi is a lecturer and work integrated learning academic lead in the School of in Information Studies at Charles Sturt University. And prior to joining at CSU, Anita spent her career as librarian and library manager in the academic library sector. Her research area includes work integrated learning, professional identity, and information literacy. And Anita is going to talk us about her seminar today about tracing Indonesian librarianship, insight from the National Library of Australia's collection. So I leave it with you, Anita, and thank you very much.
Thank you for the very kind introduction, Nilüfer. And hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. As Nilu has introduced, I'm Anita Dewi, and I'm going to present on my research that I did a couple of years ago on tracing Indonesian librarianship, and it's an insight from the NLA's collection. To guide my talk today, so that I don't go without structure, I'm going to share my screen with the good old PowerPoint slides. Can I get an indication if you can see my second screen?
Yes.
Yes, thank you. And also I've had experiences, with trouble with the Wi-Fi this morning. So just in case if things go a bit shaky, I'll turn off my my video. I hope that's okay. But let's see how we go. All right, so on tracing Indonesian librarianship insights from the National Library of Australia, that's what I'm going to be talking in the next few minutes. But before I do that, I would also like to start with acknowledgement of country. So I would begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today. I would also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I would also like to pay my respect to all First Nations elders, both past and present, from the lands where Charles Sturt University students reside. In particular, I acknowledge the Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Gundungurra, and Biripai peoples of Australia, who are the traditional custodians of the land where CSU campuses are located. I myself am joining from the Bunurong country in Southeast Melbourne. All right, so to start with, I'll just want to give you a bit of background about this project that I did. So it's about Indonesia, and Indonesia's library landscape. It actually presents a layered narrative of institution building across different eras, across different phases, from colonial, revolutionary, developmental, and digital phases. Now, I was lucky enough that I got sponsored by the Asia Study Grant in 2024, and I was allowed to explore the National Library of Australia's Asian collections, particularly those of Indonesian language materials on libraries and librarianship in Indonesia. And it was in February 2024, so across the 4 weeks period. And as you saw in the cover slide, I would also like to acknowledge and thank the Harold S. Williams Trust and, of course, the National Library of Australia, but most importantly for you, to you for being here to hear about the great collections that we have in the NLA that I have used for my project. In this project, I use secondary research method. So some of you or many of you are familiar with secondary research or test research. So it involves locating, evaluating, synthesizing the existing knowledge to address research questions without me having to collect new primary data. And it was, of course, efficient and cost effective, but it also allows a broad coverage. So it is actually a method commonly used, particularly in the case where collecting primary data is not feasible or practical. Now, as a method, secondary research includes analysis of data that has already been collected and published, such as articles, government reports, books, etc., which was what I did with this project. It can be qualitative, can be quantitative, mixed methods, depending on the source and analytical approach. So the sources that I use, so books and library sources, actually occupy a distinctive position in the secondary research space, since they provide curated, authoritative, and often longitudinal perspective that enables, amongst others, historical contextualizations, which is what this project is about. So books consolidate multiple studies into coherent frameworks and then clarifies concepts and brings about underlying assumptions and provide a breadth and historical depth, as I mentioned before. I must note here, however, that the books and library sources, they bear challenges in terms of currency, access, and discoverability. And they may lack cutting edge developments because of the production cycles, as you know, it's extended, but also potential lack of contextual coverage. So while acknowledging the limitation of secondary research that I employed in this research, in this study, the study itself is unique, as most previous research and publications on the topic are in the Indonesian language. And the impact of that is that the publications to be lack of visibility, publication today, the lack of visibility to those with no Indonesian language competence or those who are outside the Indonesian national boundary. So there's a little bit of a background about this project. Now, for this project, there are a couple of aims that I tried to do here. And apologies if I look aside to that side, I'm not looking away from you, but that's because it's my second screen is right there. So the research is aimed to map the way librarianship in Indonesia evolved, particularly from 1950s to the 2000s, because that's the coverage of the collection in the National Library of Australia. And also aims to reflect the transition and evolution of Indonesian libraries, librarianship, and librarians across time and context. And as you can see, there are 3 research questions there. So one is, what aspects impact the evolvement of librarianship in Indonesia? How did these aspects impact librarianship in Indonesia? And what was the role of National Library of Indonesia across these years? Which I think when I share my findings, it's quite interesting. Well, at least for me, it's quite interesting. The method itself of the secondary research, I employed a narrative review approach. So that focuses on interpretive synthesis and conceptual mapping based on the sources that I used. And I investigate books and library sources on the topic of librarianship in Indonesia that are held by the NLA. So across the 4 weeks of my residency there, I explored 32 sources that's been carefully selected as well. Now, almost all sources were in the Indonesian language. So in addition to the research focus itself on the library and information studies area, I guess I was quite lucky with that I've got that Indonesian language competent, both as a native speaker in my previous life as an accredited translator in the language in English. So that helped me carry out this research project. And these are the findings, like in a nutshell. There are a few things or a few items there. It's about the libraries in Indonesia, how it was across from 1950s to 2000s, librarianship education, and these are the factors that impact the evolvement of librarianship in Indonesia. Also, library professional associations in Indonesia, publications itself on the libraries in Indonesia, the government regulations, the law, and other rules on libraries and librarians, and also Indonesian libraries and librarians in the 2000s. Okay, let's have a look at them one by one now. So, referring to Basuki's work in 1994, The Indonesian era of librarianship in Indonesia, it began in the early time prior to the Dutch occupation even, or known as Zaman Awal, the early era. Following the era was the Dutch Indies era, or Zaman Hindia Belanda. It wasn't even called Indonesia yet back then, of course. And it spanned from 1778 to 1942, and then followed right through until the Japanese occupation era in 1942 to 1945. And then Indonesia declared its independence in 1945. So that's the early independence era, which lasted until 1949. And then from 1950 to late 1960s is a different era. It emerged as public library. Taman Pustaka Rakyat was developed across Indonesia. And finally, the current era of library in Indonesia, which began in 1969 when the Indonesian government set up the beginning of the first 5-year plan, or Pembangunan 5 Tahun, or PELITA. One of the sources that I found quite interesting in the NLA is that across the years, it shows that across the year, it was found that special libraries in Indonesia experienced significant growth in number. The number of special libraries, particularly those in the military bases, grew significantly in number, especially between, as you can see here, between 1980s and 1990. That time frame sits really well in with the New Order era. So when President Suharto was in power with heavy military forces for 32 years. So his regime started in 1966 after Sukarno's era, or the old order, until 1998 when Indonesia then, so there is a slight connection with the political situation, because 1998 is when reformation started in the country. Now, the Directory of Publication on Special Libraries and Information Sources in Indonesia was produced by LIPI, or Lembaga Ilmu Pengetahuan Indonesia, and Pusat Dokumentasi and Information Ilmiah. And this is the map that I got from, that I can map up from one of the sources there. But I thought that's quite interesting, because in the later I guess sources as well, it's indicated how political situation is closely related to the evolvement of librarianship in Indonesia. Now, referring to Pustakawanan Indonesia by Zen in 1992, he explored the different eras of librarianship education. And I think this is particularly close to us as educators, I guess, in a way. There are basically 5 stages, and they go by decades, more or less. So the 1950s, it's marked an early stage where the first librarianship education was established in a small scale. Course there, I put it in a quote unquote, because the term that's used is cursus, which it doesn't mean it's a course or a program as such. It's merely, or can be interpreted as an extracurricular lesson. So very minuscule scale. And then in 1960s, the librarianship education made a breakthrough. So that was the big movement there, breakthrough, by coming into the higher education context after that small scope. Now, this continued to develop, bringing about the undergraduate level of librarianship programs emerging in 1970s. By 1980s, various librarianship education institutions started to mushroom across Indonesia. And finally, in 1990s, postgrad level librarianship education started to be established. Certainly, there could be more insights gained about the later years of this librarianship education in Indonesia. However, unfortunately, this is one of the limitations of this project, because the NLA did not have any sources on that, so I couldn't really investigate on that. But generally speaking, the number of library schools at the moment in Indonesia is 30 plus. And just to give you a bit of a context as well, it does make sense, because, like, for example, in Australia, we now have 3 library schools, right? In Indonesia, have 30 plus, but the size of population is also 10 times Australian population. There are about 280 million people there. Okay, the other aspects or the other factor, along with the growth of librarianship education, library professional associations started to develop as well. So Damerpour, in her work 1975, in her article in the Australian Library Journal, actually, she elaborated that the first major organization was PAPSI, or the Indonesian Library Expert Association. It was established in 1954. Now, this association was established as a unification of Association of Library Experts. I'm just sharing with you the translation here. That's not actually the title of the associations, really. So Association of Library Experts in Yogyakarta, which is in Central Java, and Indonesian Library Association in Jakarta, which is the capital city. Both and many of these smaller associations are located in the Java island, which is the, where 70% or more Indonesian populations reside. So it's really everything is concentrated in Java. This association then transformed into PAPADI. As you can see here in 1956, PAPADI stands for Perkumpulan Ahli Perpustakaan Arsip dan Dokumentasi Indonesia, or the Indonesian Association of Library Archives and Documentation Experts. The title suggests, of course, there that the association included not only library, but also archives and documentation professionals. And then 6 years later, it simplified itself and renamed itself into Indonesian Association of Library Archives and Documentation. But in 1973, APADI and the Himpunan HPCI, or the Himpunan Perpustakaan Khusus Indonesia, Indonesian Association of Special Libraries, they combined, amalgamated, and became Ikatan Pustakawan Indonesia, right there, or Indonesian Librarian Association. So you would notice there that the archives and documentation bit is not explicitly mentioned anymore. So it's focused on Librarian Association. I must note, though, that EP here is not the only association. Although it is the main association, there are also other smaller organizations. So that's probably why, the documentation and the archives bit is not in there. Again, unfortunately, I can't find any details from the resources that I have in the National Library of Australia. Another aspect that is important and that I found, and it's factoring the evolvement of librarianship in Indonesia, is the past local, national, public academic publications. These are the 5 main ones, and I'll take you through each of them very quickly. So the first one is the analyzed sources that indicated the emergence and existence of local and national public as well as academic publication across time is the Majalah Resmi. So this one, Majalah Resmi, or official magazine of Perhimpunan Ahli Perpustakaan Seluruh Indonesia, PAPSI. We talked about PAPSI just in the previous slide. In this publication, it is stated that the Indonesian government began its operation in the library sector with the brave decision to distribute good books to all areas in Indonesia, including remote ones, instead of just building a national library, which is probably the easiest step. That was considered a bold move because most of the Indonesian population at that year, 1954, were actually illiterate. And the geographical locations, for those of you who are not familiar with Indonesia, probably you're familiar with Bali, but not so much with Indonesia as a whole. The geographical locations of Indonesia spread across more than 60,000 islands, small and big. And so it's quite a bold move, very brave. And I must also say that in this publication, it also contains some key texts like the speech of the Minister of Education, and also Indonesia-wide Library Conference decree back then in that year, and also an article on libraries in Indonesia. So it's very early on in the phases of the 1950s, as I mentioned before. The other publication that is relevant also is the Bulletin Perpustakaan dan Dokumentasi, or the Bulletin of Librarianship and Documentation by Abadi in 1972 and 73. In its volume 2, number 2, published in June 1972, there was a section about Abadi organizing a farewell for George Miller, who was a representative of NLA. Miller was then replaced by Damrapur, who published that article that I referred to before about the stages of associations. And of course, Damrapur was also Australian. So this shows that across the years, there is a long-term connection between NLA and Indonesia Library Associations. And yeah, and in the same series of publication, there were also 2 articles titled Oleh-oleh dari negara kanguru, or Oleh-oleh from the kangaroo country. And you can guess where kangaroo country is, right? They were both published by Maswan, who is an Indonesian Navy captain, actually. So in volume 2, number 3, 1972, Maswan wrote about his experience from attending an international training course in the administration of library and information services in Australia, and it was funded by the Colombo Plan. The takeaway from this course was, as stated by Maswan, that the Australian government and people of Australia paid great attention to both librarianship and information areas. He mentioned that Australians, both the educated and the lay people, already had a high level and spread out awareness about library. In the article he wrote, and I'm just going to read the quote translated into English. There were already many library staff, and work opportunities in the library sector are focused on a certain profession. Okay, I did mention about his second article as well in 1973 in the same bulletin. And in the volume 3, number 4, 1973, Maswan proposed that defense and security should be considered in developing documentation and information system in Indonesia. So reflecting on the Australian context and experience that he had through the Colombo Plan training, he saw Australia as an exemplar for libraries in collaborating effectively in a good network of system. He said that this was due to satisfaction across 7 factors. So 1 is the good communication facility, 2, sufficient collection and space, education staff, good organizational and managerial structure, consistent service pattern, willingness to collaborate, and, needless to say, factor number 7 is sufficient funding support. All right, another source on this topic that was fascinating, I found, was Jurnal Perpustakaan. It may look, yeah, that's all right, an old book series, something like that. But this publication is not only interesting or fascinating because of the interesting content, but it was also unique because of its place of publication. It was published in the locality of Makassar. So Makassar is an eastern Indonesian city outside the main island of Java. It's quite surprising that a library journal was published in Makassar, particularly during the New Order era, so 1972, 1973 is during that era, where almost everything, all national initiatives were centralized in Java, in the island of Java. And to make it even more surprising, back then, Makassar, where it was published, was renamed as Ujung Pandang, which literally means the end of eyesight. Of course, from the perspective of the Central New Order Indonesian government, which was located in Jakarta, specifically in Jakarta. Another source that I had a look into is Majalah Ilmu Perpustakaan dan Informatika, which is a magazine series which was published by the first library school in Indonesia. So that's part of Universitas Indonesia, which nowadays is one of the key library schools in Indonesia. And I know that at least a couple of you have collaboration with colleagues from UI already. NLA also holds this series, which I had a look, and it's quite interesting in that it shows us, a different perspective yet again. This is actually Congress Academic Seminar and Work Meeting of Indonesian Library Association materials. Now, this series started in the, unfortunately, I put it there, not in order. So we start from the print proceedings back in 1989, and then move on to CD-ROM format of proceedings. But then in the later year, it came back as printed materials. I don't know why, what was the reason behind that, but I just thought, why not moving on to digital after, the CD-ROM? It's quite interesting and fascinating content in that as well. Now, moving on to government regulations and laws, there are quite a few Indonesian government regulations and legal documents that are held there in the NLA. Although some are historical and no longer in effect, but I guess the discussion in this section also includes, I will also show you the newer version of the documents that are publicly available now via the government ministry's website. So in terms of the sources that are held in the NLA, the number 11, 1989 there is no longer in effect, and it was replaced by Press number 50, 1997, which was then replaced by the current one, that is the Presidential Decree number 67 in 2000. And all the three Press of three president decrees, it stated that the head of the Indonesian National Library is appointed and directly responsible for the president. So in terms of how this operates, the presidential decree stated in its chapter 3 that one, National Library is coordinated by Minister of National Education in terms of development in relation to educational policy. And the second verse of that, second clause of that chapter states that head of National Library delivers report, feedback, and consideration in their areas to the President and or Minister of National Education. I thought that says a lot about where the National Library state is positioned. The Presidential Decree number 67 in the year 2000 also talked about position level appointment and retirement of the head of the National Library in its chapter 4. And the head of the National Library sits at echelon 1A, which is the top echelon, just right below the president, and deputy is in echelon 1B. All right, and of course, NLA also holds the Indonesian law number 43, 2007 about library, which is the current law that regulates library in Indonesia. And in chapter 1, clause 1, verse 5 of this legal document, it is stated that the National Library is a non-departmental government institution tasked with government duties in the area of library and functions as coaching, referral, deposit, research, maintenance, and network library, and is situated in the capital city. So I guess that's quite interesting. The building is so grand now, but with the change or the move of the capital city to outside Java, it's going to be interesting conversation as well. And these are the, I guess, the current laws that exist and in effect, and I'm not going to go through that in details because it's not part of the NLA sources that I investigated. It's available online. Now, as part of NLA's collection as well, the series on Indonesian Digital Library Conference proceedings shed a light on how libraries in Indonesia existed in the digital era, particularly between 2008, so you can see here, until 2007. In the 2008, so that's the first one, the first conference, for example, it was proposed that the definition of digital library is a network of libraries that holds digital format collection and conducts digital service that can be accessed from a web portal that is developed as a gateway to access all collections and services conducted by all libraries included in that network. So this proceeding also includes declaration and recommendation on the Indonesian digital libraries that basically as participants of the first Indonesian Digital Library Conference back then. And the recommendation include career path for library employees. So they're talking about civil servant library employees, continuous government funding for maintenance and digital content development, government provision of computer infrastructure and communication network, and government action on synchronizing initiatives from all government institutions in relation to digital library development. Okay, now I think we come to the final source that I want to, I guess, share with you. So NLA also holds a book titled Saya Bangga Jadi Pustakawan, 33 Pustakawan Menulis Buku. While this book seems on the outside, it looks ordinary, its contents represent the voice of Indonesian librarians in the current day. So two aspects that make this book unique, I think. First is that the book was published again in Makassar, which is, I did share with you, it was termed or renamed as Ujung Pandang, literally translated as the end of eyesight. In the Eastern Indonesia during the New Order era, it was considered as, it's beyond reach, right? So while the name has been returned to rename as Makassar again, and the New Order government was overturned in 1998, it is still unexpected that such initiative like this would come from an area in Eastern Indonesia, where Makassar is situated. And another aspect that has made this book special is that 33 librarians have written chapters about themselves. Of course, it's common for library educators in Indonesia to publish, like all of us here, but it's not common for librarians in Indonesia to write and publish. Yet in this book, they present their own personal experience and journeys in becoming and proudly being a librarian. So I'm just going to share with you one quote that a librarian expressed in his chapter, Tetap teguh pada impian menjadi pustakawan, or holding my dream tight, becoming a librarian. And he said, I check books and develop abstracts like a doctor, create catalog and determine book subjects like an accountant, and build good administration like a reliable admin staff. And I play the role of a counselor when someone needs information sources. So that shows the level of, confidence that not as common for librarians, especially in Indonesia. So that comes to the conclusion. First is that Indonesian library and librarianship have transitioned from literacy-centered repositories to digitally networked infrastructure across the years. This is what I found from my project referring to NLA library sources, of course. And that factors contributing to the evolvement of librarianship in Indonesia includes librarianship education, library associations, and publications in the sector. And also found that there is a strong connection and collaboration within Australia. As an example, I mentioned before, through the Colombo Plan indicators, and one of the examples that I shared with you in the publications. And that laws and regulations on library in Indonesia have put the National Library on a nationwide privileged position, particularly with the ranking of the head and deputy of National Library. And the important role of that individual Indonesian libraries and librarians play is without a doubt. So where is it from here that I would want to pursue further research on this topic? I would like to keep disseminating findings to a broader audience in English, as discussion and publication on the topic to date has been mostly done in Indonesian language. And also, I would love to have the opportunity to get a more thorough and deeper study involving perhaps fieldwork or perhaps another secondary research, but of a broader coverage beyond that of NLA. And that would enrich the study on librarianship and professional identity of librarians in Indonesia. I guess that's it. And I welcome any comment, feedback, question, anything.
Thank you, Anita,
Thank you.
that was really interesting. I was particularly interested in your point that how the modern librarianship in Indonesia is closely tied to the country's broader process, and it was actively like redefined alongside the independence, the post-colonial state building. And for me, it was really amazing to hear the story, the narrative you give us. So I should open the floor for questions. So you can send your question in the chat or comments, or just unmute yourself and make your question or talk with Anita.
I hope I wasn't just flooding you with a lot of details just now.
Yes, Tina, please.
Yes, thanks very much, Anita. Thanks, Anita, also, and I think that it's such a privilege, Anita, as a native speaker of the Indonesian language, and also you as an accredited translator. So that's very interesting to know the other some other part of the world in terms of the librarianship and the history. I wonder, because you did mention that's where from here for the findings, dissemination, and also thorough study. I don't know whether there's some cross language studies. There will be some interest of your focus as well.
Yeah. Can I just clarify, Tina, are you referring to more on the dissemination of this project, or are we talking about beyond?
Yeah, the next is, the future's research directions. Because I know I'm aware of some interesting research in the digital humanities area. So that's a cross language. For example, the platforms. And also this I didn't remember exactly what they are doing, but interesting to see the cross language, cross platforms, or the systems are standing in the digital humanities. That's a very broad area. But some Chinese scholars, Australian scholars, they have contributed to some, the dialogues. So that will be interesting. So because always, when we try to justify the significance of the study, why it's important to Australia in terms of culture, economic, and the social impact, so that's kind of justification of the significance of the study. So I'm wondering what's the next step of this study.
Yeah, for me, as I mentioned before, more disseminating, and I've submitted it as an article, a smaller article to one of the journals for academic audience. But there is also say, for example, a conference of area studies of Indonesia or Asian studies that I thought it's worth sharing with them as well. So that's my next step in terms of disseminating. I haven't come across colleagues that's done similar in that sense of a mix, that language aspect in this, other than Indonesian. Or even Indonesian, I haven't seen that. But I'm very much keen on exploring beyond the NLA, of course, because that's very limited, as I mentioned before, even as secondary research elsewhere. Just because of the history and political situation back then, there are a lot of sources that I think I would find, and also from my experience as Indonesian subject librarian at some point of my life, I know that there are a lot of sources available in the Netherlands, for example. So I'd like to also explore that a bit further. Interestingly, sometimes what's held in the Netherlands across a couple of universities, as well as I guess the government library, the National Library or KB, sometimes they're more broad, or the coverage is more than the ones that's held in the National Library in Indonesia, which is unfortunate. But that's also something that I'd like to pursue. I hope that answers your question. I did have a chat
Absolutely.
with colleagues.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah,
I think it's more accurate when we say cross-culture studies.
Yes, yeah. Cross-culture, cross-language as well, Tina. I guess, yeah. Thank you. Good question, Tina.
Thanks so much, Anita. I've got a few questions come to mind. I guess the first one is, do the NLA kind of know what they've got here in terms of this collection? I know you were studying the sources, but I guess I'd be also interested to kind of hear if you have any information around, I guess, the NLA's collecting practices and whether they have sort of expertise within their workforce to kind of manage a collection like this. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to be, I'm trying, I will try to do my best and making this very, speaking very, I don't know what's the term, not diplomatic, but, like, yes, I'm aware of that, and they're aware of that, and that's why when I applied for the, I guess the Asia Study Grant, that's one of the aspects that they know they have things in their collections. Unfortunately, I can't speak. I don't have the Dutch language competence. If I had, I would probably go back even further to the rare books collection where the pre-Dutch or the pre-Indonesian independence will say a lot. Yes, they're familiar that they've got this type of collection, and that's why they wanted me they agreed for me to do the project. Their collection development policy at the moment, luckily, still have China. I think in terms of Asian collections, they still maintain the Chinese collections development and Indonesian collections as well. Not so much on Korean and Japanese. Like in the past. They used to have specialists on these areas, but now there is one Asian collections librarian that looks after that. Again, this was, as you said, Edward, this is beyond the scope of this project, but just by experience, because I used to, when I used to oversee Asian collections in one of the academic libraries as part of my portfolio back then, and the way Asian collections or Asian studies collection is developed in Australia was universities would work very closely with National Library of Australia. So we would make sure that at least, not too many duplicates, but we complement each other. So yeah, at the moment, I can't talk about academic libraries and their Asian collections because I know that they've reduced that bit, but National Library luckily is still developing in those areas, particularly in those two areas, Indonesian and Chinese collections. Interesting question, Edward. Thank you.
So,
Anita, sorry.
Yeah, Casey, please go on.
Yes, Casey.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could give any further insight into the NLA fellowship, because I know some people here have applied for that, and how you felt. The types, like obviously we know about your projects here, but I guess, the types of projects you could see happening during those fellowships.
Yeah, thank you. I bet that question comes from your AHOS research perspective. The reason I chose Asian Study Grant at that time is because I did a preliminary investigation, I guess, about the sources that they have there. And I thought, okay, well, it's focused on Asia. And at the scale of it, as you can see, after I screened the resources that's relevant to this topic, there are only 32 sources. So I thought this is something that I can do in a month's time. It would be different for other fellowships. When I was there, I got a show. I guess I got the show of my desk there. I guess there you go. I was given that desk, that workstation, and that's how messy it was. At times it got messier, to be honest. Anyway, so I sat there, and quite a few fellows were there for 3 months. Some did it in a few, I guess, chunks. So 1 month at a time, then go back to their institutions, go back again for another month and another month. Because there are topics that can be explored, and there are a lot of sources there. So if for colleagues who are interested in applying for fellowship at the NLA, I reckon have a look at the sources that they have, because that's what they want you to do, to really utilize and use and expose really their collections. Have a look at that and start mapping that out approximately, you know, how long you will need it there and why, because they really want to see that coming through in your proposal. I guess, I hope that helps, but I'm happy to chat further if you need more info.
Thank you, Casey, for such question, and thank you, Anita, for your insights, because I think that's very useful for early career such as me to know. So any more comments, questions? I mean, we are interested to hear from you. I guess, Anita, I have a question myself, because I'm also a second language speaker. I mean, I speak another language, and you mentioned that there has been an older tradition in the librarianship in Indonesia, which is in another language, if I'm sure, because I want to ask whether there is more traditional, like manuscript traditions in Indonesia before the modern librarianship, and how those affects the librarianship in Indonesia. Because in my own culture, we have so many influence from those era.
Mm-hmm. Yes, including if I think I did mention about the the eras. What I'm familiar with, and again, I sometimes regret my inability in the Dutch language, because that would have been very helpful. But it goes back to that day even. Less of the Japanese occupation, because literacy was not allowed in a way during the Japanese occupation, and a lot of book burning and that sort of stuff in the past. So that's the 3 years, but it's three very significant years that impacts a lot in terms of literacy in the country between 1942 to 1945. But even before the independence, during the Dutch Indies era, the production or publications in Indonesia about Indonesia across different topics has been is quite a lot. And in fact, if I may share, that was actually my first project in an academic library, and so it's a project that's so close to my heart. When I started my job or my work in a library at Monash, it was a series of publication by Balai Pustaka. It's Balai Pustaka is an Indonesian translation, but it was in the local languages, very old books, starting from the 1800s or so. So the script is not in alphabets. So when I was approached, they look for someone who could read a Javanese, not Japanese, Javanese script, so characters, understand the language. And what they said back then was, can you write the 500 notes? For those of you in the cataloging who know what that is. I was not a librarian back there, so I didn't know what a 500 note was. But they wanted the 500 notes in English. And I just happened, again, to have those three across language. So that's a really interesting point, Nilu. And the publication back then, and that's why I think it's quite consistent with what I found in this project. The publications play a key role in the development of literacy and librarianship in Indonesia, because the topics range from botany to politics to family planning to child development, and anything there. But they're all printed in and not in alphabet. I could only do the 500 note for those in Indonesian script in Japanese script that is of Japanese language, because that's my mother tongue, that's my first language, but not the ones in Balinese, same script, same characters, but in Balinese and Sundanese or West Javanese and Maduranese, I couldn't understand those. I can only, transliterate whatever the title is. But yeah, it'd be interesting, Nilo, to have a look at that. And that's actually, that's what I have in my, one of my interests in the professional identity space of an information library, information science or information and librarianship is on that space where the profession and the world of information itself has evolved across time. A lot of study, like what Tina said, has gone through, like, fast forward, like, you look ahead of what's happening, digital humanities and all that. But actually, if you look back, there's a lot of historical aspects. And I know in English and in the Brit and Australian context, correct me if I'm wrong, Casey, I think Mary Carroll has done a lot of work in that, but not in Australian, of course, but less of that in other cultures of the languages. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. So, any burning questions? So we might leave it here. And thank you so much, Anita. That was really interesting. It's been terrific to hear all about your research. And thank you, everyone, for coming today, joining us.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Neil.
Thanks, Anita.
Thank you, Anita.
Thank you. Yeah.
Thanks.